They say that love can blind you to the truth, but I never expected that my caution about gold diggers would fail me so completely when I met the woman who would become my wife, and who would systematically poison me while pretending to care for my health, ultimately driving me to orchestrate the most careful and dangerous revenge of my life by pretending to remain sick while secretly gathering evidence that would expose her attempted murder and send her to prison. My name is Harrison, and this is the story of how discovering my wife's poisoning led me to fake my continued illness and expose her deadly deception in the most devastating way possible. As a successful corporate lawyer in New York, I had learned to be extremely cautious about the women I dated. My financial success had made me a target for people who were more interested in my wealth than in building a genuine relationship, and I had developed a reputation for being selective and somewhat cynical about romantic relationships. I had been burned before by women who had seemed genuinely interested in me, but who had ultimately revealed themselves to be primarily motivated by my income and lifestyle. These experiences had made me wary and had led me to approach dating with careful attention to red flags and suspicious behavior. When I met Sophia at a small cafe in Manhattan on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, she seemed different from the women I typically encountered in my social and professional circles. She was reading a book about art history. She was dressed simply but elegantly, and she seemed genuinely uninterested in impressing anyone around her. Sophia was beautiful in a natural, understated way that suggested she was comfortable with herself and not trying to attract attention or manipulate people through her appearance. She had an intelligent conversation style and seemed genuinely curious about ideas and experiences rather than focused on material possessions or social status. Most importantly, Sophia seemed unaware of my professional success and financial situation when we first met. She didn't ask about my job or my income, and she seemed more interested in discussing books, travel, and philosophical questions than in learning about my lifestyle or career achievements. Our relationship developed naturally over several weeks of coffee dates, walks through the city, and long conversations about literature, art, and our respective backgrounds and interests. Sophia revealed that she worked as a freelance graphic designer and that she valued creativity and independence over financial security or social status. Sophia also seemed to have a genuine interest in my personality and my thoughts rather than in my professional accomplishments or financial resources. She would ask thoughtful questions about my opinions and experiences, and she seemed to enjoy our conversations for their intellectual content rather than as opportunities to gather information about my wealth. After 3 months of dating, I felt confident that Sophia was genuinely interested in me as a person rather than as a financial opportunity. She had never asked about my income, she had never suggested expensive activities or gifts, and she had consistently demonstrated values that seemed incompatible with gold-digging behavior. When I finally revealed the extent of my professional success and financial resources, Sophia's reaction was one of surprise and mild concern rather than excitement or increased interest. She worried that my wealth might complicate our relationship and suggested that she preferred the simplicity of our early dating period when financial considerations had not been part of our dynamic. This reaction convinced me that Sophia was the genuine, authentic person I had been hoping to find, and I began to consider the possibility of a serious long-term relationship with her. She seemed to represent everything I had been looking for in a partner: intelligence, independence, authenticity, and genuine affection that was not motivated by financial considerations. After 6 months of dating, I proposed to Sophia during a weekend trip to the Hamptons. She accepted enthusiastically, and we began planning a wedding that would take place 3 months later. I felt confident that I had found someone who loved me for who I was rather than for what I could provide financially. However, on the day of our engagement party, Sophia's sister Elena approached me privately with a warning that would later prove to be prophetic and crucial. Elena told me that she was concerned about my relationship with Sophia and that she believed Sophia was not the person she appeared to be. Elena suggested that Sophia had a history of manipulative behavior and that she was capable of deception and cruelty that I had not yet witnessed. She warned me that Sophia might be interested in my wealth despite her apparent indifference to material possessions, and she urged me to be cautious about trusting her completely. At the time, I dismissed Elena's warnings as sibling rivalry or jealousy. Elena seemed bitter and resentful, and I assumed that her concerns about Sophia were motivated by personal issues rather than by genuine knowledge of dangerous behavior. Sophia had never given me any reason to doubt her sincerity or her character. I also rationalized Elena's warnings by noting that Sophia had consistently demonstrated the values and behaviors that had convinced me of her authenticity. She had never shown interest in my money. She had never pressured me for expensive gifts or experiences, and she had maintained her independent lifestyle and career throughout our relationship. The wedding took place as planned, and Sophia and I settled into married life in my Manhattan apartment. Initially, everything seemed perfect, and I felt vindicated in my decision to ignore Elena's warnings. Sophia was a loving and attentive wife who seemed genuinely happy in our marriage and committed to building a life together. Sophia also continued to demonstrate the independence and authenticity that had attracted me to her in the first place. She maintained her freelance design work, she contributed to household expenses from her own income, and she never made demands for expensive purchases or lifestyle changes that would have suggested gold-digging motivations. However, 3 months into our marriage, I began to experience health problems that would ultimately reveal the true nature of Sophia's character and her real motivations for marrying me. The illness began gradually with symptoms that seemed like a common cold or flu, fatigue, nausea, headaches, and general weakness. Initially, both Sophia and I assumed that my illness was the result of stress from work or exposure to a virus. I had been working long hours on several demanding cases, and it seemed reasonable that my immune system might be compromised by exhaustion and professional pressure. But instead of improving after a few days of rest, my symptoms became progressively worse. The fatigue became debilitating, the nausea became constant, and I began to experience additional symptoms including dizziness, confusion, and severe abdominal pain that made it difficult for me to function normally. Sophia was incredibly attentive and caring during this period, insisting that I see doctors and specialists to understand what was causing my illness. She accompanied me to medical appointments, she researched my symptoms online, and she seemed genuinely worried about my health and committed to helping me recover. When multiple doctors were unable to diagnose the cause of my illness, Sophia suggested that I take extended time off from work to focus on rest and recovery. She offered to take over management of our household finances and daily responsibilities so that I could concentrate entirely on getting better. Sophia's devotion during my illness seemed to confirm everything I had believed about her character and her love for me. She was patient, caring, and selfless in her attention to my needs, and she never complained about the additional responsibilities she had assumed or the impact my illness was having on our marriage. As my condition continued to deteriorate, I became bedridden and completely dependent on Sophia for basic care and support. She prepared all of my meals, managed my medications, and handled all of our financial affairs while I was too weak and confused to manage these responsibilities myself. Sophia also took charge of communicating with my law firm about my extended absence and managing the practical aspects of my illness that I was unable to handle. She seemed to be handling everything with competence and dedication, and I felt incredibly grateful to have married someone who was so committed to our relationship. However, after several weeks of being bedridden and cared for by Sophia, I began to notice some inconsistencies and suspicious patterns in my illness and in Sophia's behavior that would ultimately lead me to discover the shocking truth about what was happening to me. The first thing I noticed was that my symptoms seemed to follow a predictable pattern related to my meals and medications. I would feel slightly better in the mornings before eating, but my symptoms would worsen significantly after breakfast and would remain severe throughout the day following each meal that Sophia prepared for me. I also began to notice that Sophia seemed unusually knowledgeable about my symptoms and unusually prepared with explanations for why I might be experiencing particular problems. She would often predict how I would feel before I experienced symptoms, and she seemed to have ready answers for questions about my condition that even doctors had been unable to explain. Most concerning of all, I began to observe that Sophia's behavior toward me had changed in subtle but significant ways since I had become ill and dependent on her care. She had become more controlling and possessive, and she seemed to be isolating me from friends and colleagues who might have been able to provide alternative perspectives on my condition. Sophia had also assumed complete control over our finances and had been making decisions about investments and expenditures without consulting me. When I asked about these financial matters, she would suggest that I was too sick to worry about such things and that she was handling everything to protect my interests. These observations led me to begin secretly investigating my own illness and Sophia's role in my care. What I discovered was horrifying and revealed that Elena's warnings about Sophia had been accurate and that I had been the victim of a sophisticated and deadly deception. Through careful observation and secret research, I realized that Sophia had been systematically poisoning me with small doses of arsenic that she had been adding to my food and medications. The symptoms I had been experiencing were consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning, and the pattern of my illness corresponded exactly with the meals and medications that Sophia had been preparing for me. I also discovered that Sophia had been researching arsenic poisoning online and had been purchasing arsenic-containing compounds through various sources. She had been carefully calculating dosages that would make me sick enough to be dependent on her care but not sick enough to die immediately or to trigger obvious suspicions about poisoning. Most shocking of all, I realized that Sophia's entire relationship with me had been a carefully planned scheme to gain access to my wealth through marriage, and then to slowly poison me to death while positioning herself as my devoted caregiver and the natural inheritor of my assets. Sophia had been using my illness to gain control over my finances, and she had been making preparations to inherit my estate by ensuring that I was too sick to manage my own affairs or to change my will. She had been planning my murder from the beginning of our relationship, and everything I had interpreted as love and devotion had actually been calculated manipulation designed to facilitate my death. The discovery of Sophia's poisoning was terrifying and infuriating, but it also presented me with a dangerous challenge. I needed to gather evidence of her crimes and ensure that she would be held accountable for attempted murder, but I also needed to protect myself from further poisoning while avoiding alerting her to my knowledge of her scheme. I decided that the safest and most effective approach would be to pretend that I remained sick and dependent while secretly regaining my strength and gathering evidence that would expose Sophia's crimes and ensure her conviction for attempted murder. The plan I developed required me to continue acting as though I was severely ill while secretly avoiding the poisoned food and medications that Sophia was providing. I would need to maintain the appearance of weakness and confusion while actually recovering my health and building a case against her. The first phase of my plan involved secretly avoiding Sophia's poisoned food and medications while maintaining the appearance of consuming everything she provided. I began secretly disposing of the meals she prepared and the medications she administered, while pretending to eat and take everything as directed. This was extremely challenging because Sophia was carefully monitoring my consumption of food and medication to ensure that I was receiving the doses of arsenic she had calculated. I had to develop sophisticated methods for disposing of poison substances without arousing her suspicion. I also began secretly supplementing my nutrition with food that I could obtain and consume without Sophia's knowledge. I would order delivery food to be left at locations where I could retrieve it when Sophia was out of the apartment, and I would eat these meals in secret while maintaining the appearance of relying entirely on Sophia's care. The second phase of my plan involved secretly documenting Sophia's poisoning activities and gathering evidence that would be sufficient to prove her crimes in court. I installed hidden cameras in our kitchen and bedroom that would record her preparing poisoned food and administering contaminated medications. I also began secretly collecting samples of the food and medications that Sophia was providing, preserving them for laboratory analysis that would confirm the presence of arsenic and establish the pattern of poisoning. This evidence would be crucial for proving that Sophia had been deliberately and systematically attempting to murder me. The third phase of my plan involved secretly regaining my physical strength while maintaining the appearance of continued illness and weakness. As I stopped consuming Sophia's poisoned food and medications, my health began to improve dramatically, but I had to carefully conceal this recovery to avoid alerting her to my knowledge of her scheme. This required me to continue acting weak and confused when Sophia was present, while secretly exercising and rebuilding my strength when she was out of the apartment. I had to maintain the performance of being a sick and dependent husband while actually preparing to confront her with evidence of her crimes. The fourth phase of my plan involved secretly consulting with law enforcement and medical professionals to ensure that I would have the support and expertise necessary to expose Sophia's crimes and protect myself from further attempts at poisoning. I contacted a detective who specialized in domestic violence and attempted murder cases, and I shared the evidence I had been gathering about Sophia's poisoning. The detective helped me develop a strategy for safely confronting Sophia and ensuring that she would be arrested and charged with attempted murder. I also consulted with medical professionals who confirmed that my symptoms had been consistent with arsenic poisoning and who provided expert testimony that would be crucial for proving Sophia's guilt in court. The fifth phase of my plan involved the careful timing and execution of Sophia's exposure and arrest. I needed to ensure that I had gathered sufficient evidence to guarantee her conviction while also protecting myself from any final attempts at poisoning or violence when she realized that her scheme had been discovered. The confrontation with Sophia took place on a Tuesday evening in April, exactly 7 months after I had first become ill and 4 months after I had begun secretly investigating her poisoning. I had arranged for law enforcement to be present when I revealed my knowledge of her crimes, ensuring that she would be immediately arrested and unable to harm me or destroy evidence. Instead of the quiet evening she expected with her sick and dependent husband, Sophia found herself confronted with comprehensive evidence of her attempted murder, including video recordings of her preparing poisoned food, laboratory analysis confirming arsenic in the substances she had been providing, and medical testimony establishing the connection between her actions and my illness. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I had documented her systematic poisoning over a period of months, and I had expert testimony confirming that her actions constituted deliberate attempted murder. There was no possibility of explaining away her behavior as accidental or misunderstood. Sophia's reaction was initially one of shock and panic as she realized that her carefully planned scheme had been discovered and that she was facing serious criminal charges. She tried to deny the evidence at first, claiming that I had misunderstood her actions and that she had been trying to help me recover from my illness. But the evidence was too comprehensive and specific for her denials to be credible. I had video recordings showing her adding arsenic to my food, laboratory analysis proving that the substances she had been providing were contaminated with poison, and medical testimony establishing that my symptoms were consistent with deliberate arsenic poisoning. When Sophia realized that denial wasn't working, she changed tactics and tried to justify her actions by claiming that she had been motivated by love and concern for my well-being. She suggested that she had been trying to make me dependent on her care because she was afraid of losing me, and she claimed that she had never intended to cause serious harm. But I was not interested in Sophia's attempts to rationalize attempted murder. She had been systematically poisoning me for months with the clear intention of killing me and inheriting my wealth. She had been willing to watch me suffer and deteriorate while pretending to care for my health, and she needed to face the full consequences of her crimes. Sophia was arrested that evening and charged with attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence I had gathered ensured that she would be convicted and sentenced to a significant prison term for her crimes. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive once Sophia's poisoning was exposed. The evidence I had gathered provided clear documentation of her systematic attempts to murder me, and expert testimony confirmed that her actions constituted deliberate and premeditated attempted homicide. Sophia's defense attorneys tried to argue that her actions had been motivated by mental illness or emotional disturbance, but the evidence showed that her poisoning had been carefully planned and executed over many months. She had researched arsenic poisoning, calculated dosages, and systematically administered poison while maintaining an elaborate deception about her motivations. The trial also revealed that Sophia had been planning to inherit my estate and that she had been making financial preparations for my death while pretending to care for my health. She had been consulting with lawyers about inheritance procedures and had been positioning herself to benefit financially from my murder. Most importantly, the trial established that Elena's warnings about Sophia had been accurate, and that Sophia had a history of manipulative and potentially dangerous behavior that I had failed to recognize during our courtship. Sophia was ultimately convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judge noted that her crimes had been particularly heinous because they had involved a systematic betrayal of trust and a deliberate exploitation of the vulnerability that comes with illness and dependency. The aftermath of Sophia's conviction was both relieving and traumatic. I was grateful to have survived her poisoning and to have successfully exposed her crimes, but I was also devastated to realize how completely I had been deceived about her character and her motivations for marrying me. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of trusting warning signs and being skeptical of people who seem too good to be true. Elena's warnings about Sophia had been accurate, and I should have taken them more seriously despite my confidence in my own judgment about Sophia's character. I also learned that sophisticated deception can be extremely difficult to detect, especially when it involves someone who is skilled at manipulation and who has access to intimate knowledge about your vulnerabilities and dependencies. Looking back on this experience, I am proud of the way I handled the discovery of Sophia's poisoning. I could have confronted her immediately when I first became suspicious, but instead I took the time to gather comprehensive evidence that ensured her conviction and protected me from further harm. The marriage that I had thought was built on love and mutual respect had actually been built on calculated deception and murderous intent. But the process of exposing Sophia's crimes had also revealed my own resilience and strategic thinking, and it had prepared me to approach future relationships with appropriate caution and wisdom.